Well, hello, everybody, church. Can you believe this is our 16th episode? We have been going now for 4 months, and it has been exciting every week. And we're learning, and we're meeting new people, and we are very excited to be on this journey with you. Over the last 16 weeks, I guess the most common response we have received from so many of you is, how can we help? And I have a few thoughts about that. I'm going to share how you can particularly help at the very end of this conversation starter. But what I want to do first is I want to kind of introduce you to my very favorite Bible character of all time. It may surprise you. It's not one of the big names, Moses or David or the Apostle Paul or Simon Peter. It's a little more obscure character by the name of Barnabas. And yet, Barnabas is one of the most important characters mentioned in the New Testament. And he, just like many of you, has that incredible spirit of wanting to help. Every time we see him, he is helping in a way that's very impactful. We're introduced to Barnabas in Acts chapter 4, if you wanted to get your Bible. And we'll read the verse 36 to kind of set all this up. So Acts 4:36 says this, Joseph, we're going to find out he gets his name changed in just a few minutes. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. So that's kind of the way it's set up. Joseph, the apostles call him son of encouragement, and he is from Cyprus, and he is a Levite. Let's break that down just quickly. A Levite means that he was from the line of Levi, which was one of Isaac's sons in the Old Testament. And that would be a person who was associated with the priest in their temple duties. Those people who were associated with temple service had to be from the tribe of Levi, or actually Levites. They might be a doorkeeper in the temple or a musician in the temple, but basically their lives revolved around working in the temple. So that's one thing we know about Joseph. He was a Levite, but then it also said he was from Cyprus. And that means he was not born in Israel. He was what is called a Hellenist. And Hellenists were Jews who were born overseas. They were regarded as foreigners. They did not speak Aramaic, which native Israelites did. They were considered defiled because they obviously must have picked up Gentile ways. And they experienced, usually their whole life, deep racism and prejudice. Now think about this just for a moment. Here's this guy that I'm going to tell you is one of the great helpers in the history of the church, Barnabas, but he is raised with kind of an interest in spiritual things. He's tied to the temple and what the temple is all about through his birth line, but he also is a foreigner. He's experienced probably racism his whole life. Barnabas could have, had he chosen, he could have chosen bitterness to be his way of life. People treated him bad because he was an outsider. But look at that verse again. Did you remember what it said? His name was Joseph, but the apostles called him Barnabas, which meant a son of encouragement. So here was a guy that could have been bitter because of being treated poorly, but instead he said, you know what, I don't have time for that. I'm going to be an encourager and I'm going to be a helper in my life. He had learned to say, if I want to help, I'm going to have to look for ways to encourage people on their journey. In other words, he was not going to let racism, he was not going to let prejudice hold him back or make him bitter. He was going to help people whatever it took on the journey. Now, here's something else I think is interesting about Barnabas. Did you know he is the first recorded donor in the history of the church? Now, I'm not saying others didn't give. We have records of that in Acts chapter 2. It says the whole church, everybody was giving, and that was a wonderful thing. But as far as seeing a name attached to someone giving, Barnabas is the first one. Acts chapter 4, verse 37. Read it with me. He, Barnabas, sold a field he owned and brought the money, and he put it at the apostles' feet. He was obviously a very generous person. Being generous has always been a trademark of encouragers, of people who have a heart to help. Think about all the hospitals and charities that have been funded by followers of Jesus down through the millennia of time, literally trillions of dollars given. But the very first person that has his name out beside the gift is the one Barnabas. And I think that's very, very important. Generosity is certainly a beautiful thing inside the church and outside the church. I was thinking just before we started recording this talk, just about generous things that I have experienced in my life. And this popped into my mind. I was a young divorced dad. And I remember going out to eat with my two sons, and I'm thinking that maybe Ethan, my youngest son, he might have been 3. Ray, my older son, was like 6. And, we were, like many of you know, we were just barely getting by, but we were going out to eat together as a family. And I remember saying to the boys, listen, guys, we're going to drink water. I know you like Coca-Cola, but we're not going to drink Coca-Cola. We're going to drink water and no desserts, all right? No desserts. We'll go to your granny's house after we leave here and we'll get a moon pie or whatever the deal was. But anyway, so we ate. We had a nice little family time. And as I was waiting for the check, the waitress came over and she said, hey, I just want to let you know your check is covered. Someone saw you sitting here and they just wanted to take care of the check. And I was kind of flabbergasted, but without missing a beat, my 3-year-old son, Ethan, said, oh, man, we should have ordered dessert. And we've laughed about that now. He's 35 years old. And it's always, man, we should have ordered the dessert. But that's just an example of generosity. People who just go above and beyond and just look for ways to bless and to help. And I know you've experienced that. You've probably done that your whole life. Let me tell you something else about this wonderful person by the name of Barnabas, who was such a great, great helper. He was known as a defender of people, an advocate for people who needed to be advocated for. This may surprise you, but when the Apostle Paul first became a Christian, his reputation had been rough, right? Before he became a Christian, he was a religious zealot, and you know that type. I mean, he's trying to force everybody to do it like he does it. And if they don't, then he's got papers that lets him arrest people and charge them with the high crime of rebelling against Judaism. But then he becomes a Christian, and his whole world is changed. And look at what happens. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Look at this. Meanwhile, Saul, this is setting up the story, Saul, still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples, he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. Then he becomes a follower of Jesus. So he leaves Damascus and he travels to Jerusalem. And guess what? The church in Jerusalem, they don't have anything to do with him. They say, no way, we're hiding. This is a bad guy. We've heard about him. We don't want to have anything to do with his type. But look at what Acts chapter 9, verse 27 says. But Barnabas, golly, I like this guy. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. And you know what? Barnabas putting his arm around Saul, who would later become Paul, and introducing him around, that made the difference. Verse 28 says this, so Saul stayed with them, and he moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Isn't that beautiful that someone could become an advocate like that? You guys remind me of that. I see all the time mama bears. I see them becoming advocates for people who are just stepping into who they really are, and mama bears putting their arms around them and saying, we'll advocate for you. We have a man in our church, Roy Blankenship. Roy had probably one of the largest counseling centers, Christian counseling centers in America, attached to one of the biggest churches in America. But Roy came out as gay, and as he came out as gay, his wife passed away. He was dealing with, was he going to walk in his own truth? When he said, I'm going to walk in my own truth, and he went public on Facebook, you know what? It was mama bears that put their arms around him symbolically. And whenever he would be attacked, whenever anyone would try to tell him he wasn't doing what was right, because you couldn't be gay and a Christian, these mama bears would put their arms around him. And I'm telling you, they were Barnabas 1,000,000 times over. It was so, so beautiful. And I just appreciate that. Many of you are masters at doing that very thing. Now, next time we see Barnabas, it's when some people began to share the message of Jesus outside of Judaism, and actually they're sharing it with Gentiles. And you've heard Stan talk about this. It's a beautiful picture of how it took the church a long time to understand that Gentiles could become saved. And we still struggle with some of those very thoughts today. Who can really get it and who can't get it? But these Gentiles were becoming followers of Jesus, but the church in Jerusalem, they weren't so sure. So you know what they did? They said, we need to send Barnabas for him to check it out. So the Jerusalem church sends Barnabas to a place called Antioch to check it out. And look at what it says, Acts chapter 11, verses 23 and 24. When Barnabas arrived, he saw the evidence of the grace of God, and he was glad, and he encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Again, the idea is, Barnabas says, hey, these are good people. These are people that know God for sure. There were ample verses in the Old Testament that gave the impression that certain groups of people were outsiders and could not really be followers of God. We know now those verses were being misunderstood. That's not at all what the heart of God is. We know that through the teaching of Jesus, God's love is for all people. Barnabas understood that way back then, and Barnabas was helping the church understand that. He fought for helping people who were perceived as outsiders. He wanted them all to be accepted as part of the family. I find it very much like Jesus to fight for ones others don't want to include. Lepers in the life of Jesus, the handicapped in the life of Jesus, the Gentiles, Barnabas showing us how to reach out to the Gentiles, the poor, the tax collector, the sinner, the drunkard, the Samaritans. Jesus' arms were wide open. Let them all come. Let them all come. And Barnabas understood that. He didn't discriminate. Something else about Barnabas. Being an encourager and a helper of people is never about a big ego. I love this. Just 3 simple verses that tell a story. Think about this. The first verse I want to read is Acts chapter 11, verse 30. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. Get the order. Barnabas and Saul. The most prominent person first, Barnabas and Saul. Remember, Saul's just become a Christian. Barnabas and Saul. Second verse, Acts 13:2. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them. You see it again? Barnabas and Saul. The most prominent person, Barnabas. Second person, Saul. Keep reading chapter 14. Listen to this. Listen close. You'll catch it. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. Did you hear the switch? Barnabas and Saul, Paul and Barnabas. What happened? Barnabas, when it was time for him to take a step back and become a support to the Apostle Paul, the one who was kind of beginning to step out and do these amazing things, he simply slid into that support position. He had been leader until it was time for Paul to lead. When Paul became the leader, he stepped in the support position. I think that is huge. And how many people have I known who were not able to, when the time came for them to just be a support, they didn't know how to be a support. They either knew how to be the boss or not be anything at all. And I think the mature position is to, if I need to lead, I'll lead. But if I need to support, I'll certainly support. Let's look at something else about Barnabas. And this will be the final thing. If I want to be an encourager and a helper, and obviously so many of you do, then I'll focus on improvement and growth, but never perfection. And let me tell you what I'm talking about. So many people, when they see someone struggling, they give up. But that was never the way Barnabas was. When Barnabas saw people struggling, he never gave up. Here's the story. Paul and Barnabas get together and decide to go on a missionary journey. It'll be the first missionary journey, and they're going to go through Asia Minor. It's a big trip. And they choose to take John Mark with us. We find out that John Mark is related to Barnabas, and he's just a young follower of Jesus, just a young guy. So you have Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark. This is the verse, Acts 13:13. From Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. Think about this. They've started a missionary journey. They're going into hostile territory. And on that missionary journey, John Mark says, I'm out, guys. I'm out. This is scary. It's dangerous. They're throwing rocks at us. I quit. Okay, Paul and Barnabas continue on the journey. They finish the journey. They've rested a little bit, and they decide to take the second trip. And look what happens. Sometimes later, this is Acts 15, verses 36 through 39. Sometimes later, Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and let's visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. So Paul says, let's go on another trip. Barnabas says, let's take John, the one who's called Mark, with us. But Paul didn't think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. And they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Have you ever heard that before? Paul says, no, he failed us. He screwed up. He dropped the ball. He quit on us. He was a scaredy cat. We can't take him with us. Barnabas is saying, look, Paul, he was young. Let's give him another chance. Let's see if he hasn't grown up a little bit. Paul says, absolutely not. And so the two brothers in the Lord said, well, you go your way, I'll go my way. And Barnabas actually takes Mark with him, and he sails to Cyprus. So Paul goes this way, Barnabas and Mark go this way. Well, was that the wise thing to do? Now, I get what Paul's thinking. The missionary field probably was very rough. I get that. But Barnabas was the one who was saying, you know what, he screwed up. But we're not going to judge him on that. Let's give him another chance. And I think Barnabas was right. Did you know that church historians tell us that John Mark, later in life, would become a traveling companion of Peter and actually would translate often for Peter? And they also believe that Mark's gospel was the first gospel that was written, and it is written often from the perspective of Peter, that Peter had spoken these words about what he had witnessed, and John Mark put them down. But here's John Mark, the one who was kicked off the team, not going to be allowed to come back. And Barnabas says, no, let's take him with us. And now he has proven himself as the writer of the first gospel, at least in time. The first gospel we have, they tell us, is from John Mark. Let me tell you something else. The Apostle Paul, near the end of his life, is in prison. And this is what he says. He's alone in the prison, and he is writing to his friend Timothy. And he says this, Timothy, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I always loved that. Paul, the one who said, no, he can't go. Sorry, you can't go. Now at the end of his life is saying, hey, bring him to me. He would be very helpful to me. Thank God Barnabas knew failure didn't have to be final. Failure is just a moment in time. And listen, gang, I hope you get that. I lived in so much shame for so long because of failure. I would do something, screw something up, and I would just beat myself up. Listen, failure is a moment. Failure's not final. You don't have to let it be. Barnabas understood that and extended grace to John Mark, and that made the difference. It really is important that we learn from characters like Barnabas how to be helpers, encouragers, how to become really difference makers in people's lives. You ever think about your funeral? I know that was crazy, but I do. I think about it all the time. I think about who will come. I think about if they come from the village, will they be on time? A lot of times village people aren't on time. What do we need to do? Tell them it's going to be much earlier so they'll show up. I don't know. And then what will they say about my life? Will I have really made a difference in people's lives? Really? I think about Barnabas's funeral. Can you imagine that with me for just a moment? Can you imagine the crowd hushed, the service just about to begin, and in from the back walks the Apostle Paul, and everybody kind of gasped because he's famous. I mean, he wrote more of the New Testament than anybody. And he gets up behind the rostrum and he begins to speak. And he says, when I first became a follower of Jesus, I didn't know if I was going to make it or not. Barnabas came along beside me, and he ran interference for me. He even went to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem and said, hey, cut this guy some slack. He's a good guy. He's a follower of Jesus. He wants his life to be different. I would not have become who I became had it not been for Barnabas. And then I see little lady coming forward, and she begins to speak, and you realize she doesn't speak the language we understand, so they call for a translator. And as she speaks through the translator says she was a part of the group in Antioch. She didn't know even the language that they spoke in Jerusalem. She didn't know Aramaic. And they had become Christians. And it was Barnabas who went and said, we need to receive these people. They're followers of Christ. And she tells a beautiful story. And then a poor person comes forward and says, in the very first church we ever had in Jerusalem, Barnabas gave money, and that money was used to help those of us that didn't have. And we are so grateful. And then they call for one more person. And it's John Mark. From the very back of the room, he comes forward. And he says, you'll never, ever understand how important it was when I had fallen to have Barnabas lift me up and not give up on me. And he gives a wonderful testimony about what Barnabas' life meant. I am telling you, when I think about Everybody Church, and I think about you, those who watch every week, I think about you being some of the finest encouragers and helpers on the planet. You are Barnabas. And I think all of us are called to become Barnabas in our life, to really extend a hand and help every time we can. You know, it's not about watching a talk, watching a conversation starter or a sermon or going to a church. It's about what's happening on the inside that's changing what we do. When we step out of our house, are we looking for ways to help people? Now, I promised you I was going to give you a couple of thoughts about Everybody Church, some things that could be helpful for us. If you want to help, these are some things that we're looking for, and so I hope you can. The first thing is think about becoming a monthly giver. We have had people who have given one-time gifts, and that is beautiful. We've had a handful of people who have given recurring gifts. Can I tell you something? As we have our meetings and as we look at next steps for where Everybody Church is going, how we are growing and developing and what needs to take place, we watch carefully the recurring gifts. We're not asking people to give an extraordinary amount to Everybody Church. We are just asking, if you could you give $50 on a recurring basis? Could you give $25 on a recurring basis every month? So we can kind of expect that's going to be coming in. Some, it might be 100 or 200 or 300. We understand. But you want to know how you can really help Everybody Church? One of the great ways would be become a recurring giver. And you can do that by going to everybodychurch.org. If you go to everybodychurch.org, it's real easy to set that up. And this will kind of help us figure out where we're going next steps. So it's very important. Second thing is share post. Neil does some of the most creative things I have ever seen around Everybody Church. I don't know if you saw the Everybody Church, just the beautiful heart with the rainbow colors that came out just the other day. That was one of the stunning. And so many of you are sharing it. I mean, keep sharing things when they come down. When Rachel Held Evans passed away, we were kind of one of the first groups that began to share that news and kept people abreast of what was happening as she was on life support before she passed. When you can share those kind of things, it's very, very helpful, and it lets people find out beyond our group a little bit more about Everybody Church. So make sure that you do that. Third thing is to invite friends to become a part of our community. It's interesting. I was having lunch the other day with a Jewish businessman, and I was telling him about Everybody Church, and he got so excited. He said, that's the coolest idea I have ever heard in my life. And he was a Jewish businessman who has no real interest in the whole Jesus story. He's a Jewish businessman. But he said, Ray, I love that idea. And you know what? I find a lot of people feel the very same way. So I'm going to encourage you to do your best to invite friends to become a part of this community. Tell them you have found a church that is a wonderful church, and that you don't have to get up early and go to it. You can watch it from your comfort of your home. Get people to become a part. And finally, begin to connect with people that you are meeting through Everybody Church. There are, 5 or 6 people that have become, for me, friends over the last couple of months. And I have not met them face to face yet, but I feel like I know them. We have shared correspondence back and forth, and they feel like they know me. I feel like I know, and I feel like the time will come, and it'll be sooner rather than later, when we will sit and break bread together, and I feel like we are becoming family. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to find some people and connect with them, follow their posts, write them, encourage them, be you to them. You are beautiful. You are wonderful. You be that precious you that you are to them, and become family. We can do this. We can do this. I hope the conversation started is helpful. I love you guys very much. Stan will be back with us next week. I hope you have a fabulous week. Can't wait to see you soon.